For the record, I'm Donald Westmore, and I'm interviewing Nadine Rumke, July 10th, 2009, in preparation for the 300th anniversary of the arrival of the Palatines to Germany.
Well, I was born in Hudson Hospital in November 4th, 1927, and I was named Jeanne, Jenne, Nadine Hover. And my mother first called me Jean or Jeannie, I don't know. And then I became Nadine. The baby book said baby Jean, and then all of a sudden the baby book said Nadine. So why the change, I don't know. So I'm now known by my middle name. Though growing up, my comrades said, Nadine, it rhymes with sardine. We're going to call you Sandy. So I was known all through my life as Sandy, until, of course, I went to college, and then I became Nadine. My parents were Charlotte Adele Hutchings Hover, and my father was Leland Procius Hover. This is interesting because of the difference. It's like I was an only child, because my sister was born in 1911 in Monticello, Wisconsin. My brother was born in November of 1913. And then 16 and a half years later, I came along. And I have a funny story about that, because my parents were both in their 40s at that point. They were both card players. And someone among the card players decided, well, it's time to have another child. And who is going to be the first one? There were other Hover members and other card members. And guess who won the prize? My parents. So I became the child that came along next. Ancestor-wise, we go back on my mother's side the furthest. I have scrolls here that show that my mother's ancestors came over on the Mayflower. And there were three ancestors. One was the Captain Francis Cook, and the other two were the famous lovers of Priscilla Mullins and John Alden. And I think that's written up in some stories or histories. We never knew that until some member of the family died without any records, and the lawyers had to go back. And my mother was blessed to have gotten a small inheritance. And until that point, we had no knowledge that that's how far back her family side went. On my father's side, we go back to the Palatinate. And my oldest relative or ancestor would have been Christian Haber. Originally, they spelled the name as Habber. And of course, when they came over to come in as emigrants, the name got changed because of the German accent. It became Haber. And the next thing was, I think, in the writing, B's as the way they wrote it, became a V, so it became Haver. Finally, Hover. So there were many changes of this name. And Christian Haber, and we come down, and there's a long lineage of many relatives, but that's how far back we go on my father's side. I have in front of me a map that goes back to 1813. And looking back at my ancestors, we come down the Hover line from two brothers of John and Andrew Hover. And this is a map of their properties. I'm of the descendants of the Andrew Hover. And my lineage comes down, of course, this was all Hover property in through here, and they divided it up. I think they were mostly farmers. Trying to recall, I know when we inherited this place, it was farming, and farming seemed to be strictly, that's all I'm aware of as farmers. When I grew up here, my grandfather was still alive, and there were cows, there were all kinds of pear trees, peach trees, apple trees, cherry trees, and there were even cows in the barn. but they were cows for supplying other dairy farmers. And so I remember growing up, with fresh milk and all of fresh vegetables and fresh fruits. On my mother's side, I remember all I can go back to is that my grandfather, whom I never met, was a fisherman. And she grew up in Cheviot. And I know her father, John Harmon Sawpaw, was a fisherman on the Hudson River. The Hoover family inherited this place in the 1885s. It had belonged to an Amanda Phillips who had married a Hoover, and I know it was granted to her or mortgaged to her by an Alexander W. Hoover, who was the father of 5 sons. And when it came back to him, it then was given to my grandfather, Charles Edgar Hoover, one of the 5 brothers, as a wedding present. So our Hoover family has lived here ever since 1885. I have a picture of my home, and it shows how it has changed over all the years. There was a big porch across the front, and I wish I had a picture of that here. But in the 1930s, after my grandfather died, my father being the construction engineer, he changed it and took the front porch off and put on a little vestibule. That was the first of the changes that were made to the house. I've been told over the years that I'm related to everybody in Germantown. So I know that's so because there were so many families, so many brothers. Some families had 14 children. We don't know where all the relatives went. I did this chart up myself just to see where the relatives were, and realizing when they had 10 and 12 children in a family, and we all stayed here in Germantown, that there were lots of relatives. So when I rolled this out, I became amazed. I'm related to the Rockefellers. I'm related to the Finger family in Germantown. I'm related, and looking as I look at here, I'm related to the Crawford family, the DeWitt family. There's Lashers included here. There's Clums included here. And I think I could go on and on and on, because one of my relatives goes back to Johannes Hoover, and who married, can't see it, a Rivenberg. So Clums, Lashers, and I don't even know who I'm all related to, because there are so many, from many different branches. Another treasure that I have that has been hanging up on our wall is the actual wedding certificate of my grandfather and my grandmother. This is Charles Edgar Hoover and Minnie Alice Miller, who became his wife. And they were married in, I'm looking for the year, September of 1885. My father was born the year later in the home in which I reside, and the room that I'm in right now was part of the very original house, which we think was built in about the 1860s. Traditions, I'm thinking of traditions. I remember one that was very important for my father and perhaps my mother. Many of the family are buried here in the Dutch Reformed Church that's at the cemetery, top of the cemetery hill, as we call it. Every Memorial Day, it was our task to gather all the lilacs that were in bloom, because that was the appropriate time, and we would fill baskets, lovely baskets, and take them to all the cemeteries. Grandparents were buried in the Cheviot Cemetery, so we would go down there and take baskets to that particular cemetery. Sundays, well, this was a tradition that was not with meeting other people, but we raised chickens, and every Sunday it was a chicken on the table. And I remember we would go out to the chicken house, take care of the chicken. That would be the day before. I can be part of their defeathering the chicken. And I was taught how to clean the chicken. And that was every Sunday was a chicken. They sent me to the church down here at the Reformed Church. My social life kind of evolved around that church. There was living out here where my mother didn't drive, so I had to depend on my father to take me to the church. When I became a teenager, I could bicycle down to the Christian Endeavor, and so that was my social life at that point. Going to the Christian Endeavor classes, going off to their special gatherings on a Sunday night, singing in the church choir, being a part of that, all through high school. That became my social life. Well, I had a very strict Sunday school superintendent who did not approve of dancing or movies or any of the sort. And so there was no dancing as a part of my growing up in through the church. My socializing outside of the church became when I got into high school and made friends with a dear Polish friend. And then we got to the Polish hops, but somebody else would take me. And that's how I got into loving the dancing. But as far as the church having social, it was strictly church. Foods were very simple. I can remember corn being grown out here, so there was corn on the table. My father took my mother to shop in what was the Central Market now, and across the street was the Steers Market, but we got most of our meat and all our vegetables from Tracy Rockefeller, who ran the Central Market. And I think my father was instrumental as a civil engineer in building that building in the first place. But that's where all our groceries came from. It was very simple. It was always very local that we went to buy our groceries. And he liked things very, very simple. So I didn't have German foods until I got married into another German family. When I was growing up, it was strictly pretty simple. But my introduction to German foods came when I married Henry Rumke. His father, Christian Rumke, had come over in the 1800s, and he'd married a Katharina Heisenbudel. And that was an interesting story because that was a milkman marrying the nanny of the house. And they moved up here in about 1911. They purchased a farm a mile and a half away. And then when I married into that family, I became introduced. They used to make their own sausages. They had the smokehouse. So they brought along all the nice knockwurst and bratwurst and the different German foods. So I became introduced to them when I married Henry. And I moved over there and got into making the breads and doing the German style of dishes, the sauerkrauts and all of that. But it wasn't with my family that I don't think, going back to the Hover side, I think they were very simple in their eating. And I remember eating fish here, but not fish at the other place. It was strictly the porks. And they shopped at the other store, the Benjamin Steer store in Germantown. So the two families, both German, but one more recently German. When I was young, I remember my mother speaking to me when I was a naughty child. Das ist verboten. I remember that well. And she taught German. She took German when she was went to Hudson High School. She went to a little one-room school right there in Cheviot. And when she reached high school age, she hopped the train and went to Hudson High School. And now my mother and father were both born the same age, so I'm not sure if they met traveling the train to Hudson High School. There were no German words taught in this family because perhaps it was too far removed. My husband His parents, having more recently come from Germany, the mother did not read English, but she spoke German to her husband. But speaking German to the children was forbidden. They wanted them to learn English. In my family here, when I grew up, it was the traditional Christmas tree. I just can remember coming down. They would send me to bed, and with the traditional story about Santa Claus, you had to go to bed. But I remember waking up, this still is imprinted in my memory, of a Christmas tree in that dining room in there, great big Christmas tree. And I snuck down, I think, at 4 a.m. in the morning. And the only light was somehow there must have been a beautiful moonlight or starlight night, because I opened some presents by starlight or moonlight. And then I went back to bed again. But that I remember. There were not many presents growing up. There were a few presents under the tree. And I still have to this day a doll that I'd asked for that was this big. It was a cloth-bodied doll with one of these special, the head. And I think I still have that doll to this day because I had asked for that. Christmas time also brings me to winters. And winter, I think of the snow we used to have. In that dining room window, I remember snow coming up to the windowsill. That's how much snow there was out there. And I could go out and I would tunnel in that snow. And it was great fun to make igloos. This is all, 5, 6, 7 years of age. And that doesn't seem to be happening today, that amount of snow. I'd love to go out to the barn and watch them milk the cows and, squirt the milk to the little cats. I'd love to watch them when they brought in the hay. It was horse and wagon. And it was a great big mound of hay. And I'd watch them go into the barn and put the pitchfork down in and pick up the big load of hay and drop it off into the hay mow. And I was lucky if they didn't unload it that day, because I was brave. I'd climb up in the hay mow and jump off and slide down the side of that big hay wagon. And I'd take my 2 friends down here. We would do that. We would all slide down in the hay and play. That's the way we played. We entertained ourselves in those kinds of ways. I rode the same school bus as my husband did, because houses are only 1.5 miles away. The big guys sat in the back, and we smaller ones would sit up in the front. And this is the relationship when I would say, noticed my husband, because we rode the same school bus, which is interesting in our connections. We were 6 years of difference in age, so when he's a high school guy, I'm somewhere in the elementary. You look back at the seniors and you're in awe of the seniors sitting in the back of that school bus. And I looked back at him and looked at him and must have caught his attention or something, because he says to me, "What are you looking at?" And I look at him and said, "Nothing." And this is the man I married. Miss Hollenbeck was a very well-built lady. And in our class was Ralph Lasher. And he was the jokester of the class. I remember he was writing on the blackboard, Miss Hollenbeck was, and she bent over to pick up something from the floor. And you heard, rip! What Ralph had done was taken his handkerchief and ripped. And the poor dear lady, she was horrified. What had ripped? We could see her distress. And I knew what had happened, but she never knew, because he was always pulling funny tricks. Going back a generation, my father, who of course grew up here too, all he had to do was walk across this meadow, down this lane, and the building right across the meadow here was the schoolhouse that he went to, which is interesting because many years later, I think somewhere in the 20s, he bought that from the school system and turned it into his business, which was a lumber company. And then it went into the Depression years. That's when he was doing the carpentry and doing a lot of building. And when I got to the junior in high school, my father had then become superintendent of highways of Columbia County, and so he was traveling to Hudson all the time. I took that opportunity to leave Germantown and go to Hudson, which was a class of 150 instead of 13, so that I could pick up Spanish and art, because it wasn't offered in Germantown. I'd had Latin and taken all these other classes. And I'm glad I did, because it was a preparation for me to be able to go to Cornell. From a class of 13 into Cornell would have been devastating. I think I needed the change to go into a bigger school. So in a sense, I suppose I deserted Germantown, but I still feel absolutely a part of it. Going back to schooling, though, on a different tangent, I was into music, and I was part of plays. And there were a number of plays I did, and always had a part in some of the musicals that they had. So I had private piano lessons at the time when it was 50 cents a lesson. It is so different today. And they took me to a lady who had been trained, and that had been my dream, to be a piano teacher or a music teacher. But that kind of evolved and changed into being a regular teacher down the road. When I met my husband, it was by going to a stock car race with our brothers. And that was the beginning of our dating, but that was way after college. And that's all I remember in that respect. As far as dating, it didn't exist at all. I think our family being isolated here and my mother not being able to drive kept me pretty isolated. There were no young men along my street. There were only other gals. So my social contacts were with a family on the very far corner down here. We would go back and forth. We'd put plays on, and I'd write the plays, and then we would be acting as a part of it. Didn't have a television. I remember sitting and listening to the radio, and my favorite Saturday morning class was plays for children, which were stories telling. I remember something called The Shadow Nose and sort of thing, but it was always the radio. And then I always got read to. I remember my father was a great one to entertain me. He loved cards. We played checkers. He played little games with me, Pollyanna games, so that I became a game-loving person. But it was an interaction with playing games with him. They needed somebody when I was in high school to play cards because my mother didn't always want to play, so they needed somebody. So a Friday night thing was my mother, my father, my brother, a relative, Rudolph Coons, who's in the family, and myself. I learned to play bridge at a very young age because they needed somebody to play. And it was wonderful to, have that interaction of playing with people. So we entertained ourselves in a very different way. We were not entertained. Now here's some names coming up, and these people are alive. There was a Paul Dodge, a Dougie Dodge, Elaine Lawrence, and they'd come out. I have a picture of us walking down through the woods down the road. Jan is back down here, and we would go out in the streams. We would peruse the woods and the streams, and I have a picture of us. Somebody took a picture of us, just loving outdoor nature. My brother-in-law, Howard Disbrow, who died in World War II, was into all kinds of things. They would take their car, drive it up Eastern Parkway, and I would be pulled behind on skis, something you wouldn't think of doing today. But that's what we did. I remember when they were married, he was a part of the Lions Club. We got down to get on the Hudson River on the ice boats. I remember being out on the wing of one of those rudders on the ice boat and going down on the Hudson River. Also, we took our skates and we skated. We would hold up big sheets to hold us as sails and skate where it was safe on the Hudson River. So this is a childhood memory you've just kind of awakened in my mind. Here's something else. I remember when the ice house existed in front of that pond, we called it Abrams Pond, and I can remember seeing the horses out there cutting the chunks of ice that would be put into the ice house. And I know my husband's family had an ice box, not a refrigerator, an ice box, and his job was to put the ice into that. I do remember parties. We would ice skate on Abrams Pond. We would build a bonfire and we'd roast marshmallows there. And that would be a gathering, but I don't remember any boys in particular, but it was a gathering of many of us for skating on a Sunday night or a Saturday night or a Friday night down there, and I think many people did. My mother had a great big victory garden over here, and we would can many tomatoes because I have a food cellar down here in which we put a lot of the vegetables over the winter. Oh, we canned and canned and canned, and I remember being a part of that. My father was part of the Lions Club. It met at the Central House, which is now trying to be refurbished. We always did a spring apple blossom festival time. There were parades that we would go to, that would go through, and different people would be chosen to be queen and ride on the back of this float. There was Mr. Lawler had a soda fountain that we could go in and sit at the fountain, and he would make the sodas for us. Across the street, I think, there was a card shop. The Depression affected our family a lot. I remember my mother being very conservative. I remember she cut down a coat of hers to make a pair of snow pants for me, and I can still feel the texture of it as being a coat. Of course, since we had our cows out here, I remember the making of the butter. So we had butter, we had milk, they made the cheeses, we had the vegetables, and that's when we did a lot of canning. As far as being financially strapped, they never talked about finance. The only way I would know it as a child during that period of time, because I was very young, would be the tensions that's in the household. People don't talk about what's bothering them. You would sense that something was wrong. It did not stop my brother and sister from going off to college in the late 20s and 30s, but it sent them. My sister went to Syracuse for 2 years. They found Texas was much more affordable, so my sister and my brother went off to Texas. This is of 1931, when my brother and sister were packed to go to Texas University. And that's me standing on the running board of this car. I have in front of me the picture of the second graduating class of Germantown. And in it is a fellow teacher, Helen Coons, who became Helen Henderson. I have also relatives in here. Here's a Ferdinand Rumke, who became my brother-in-law. And there is another cousin, Rudolph Coons, who's on the family tree as well. My brother graduated in a later class, and he is stated here, he was our valedictorian of this class. My brother is the one that loved all the antiques, the genealogy, and he's done much work with genealogy. And I found lots of old pamphlets that he saved, and I can credit him with saving them. I found the very first, I guess you'd call newspaper from Germantown, and they called it Spilled Ink, Christmas of 1927. In here, the picture of the original school as it was finished before any additions were made to it. They wrote strange articles like chewing gum. It was written in 1927, chewing gum. The best thing on the market for furniture decoration in the school is chewing gum. It is said by doctors that chewing gum is the cause of 2/3 of the appendix operations in the country. It is not an uncommon thing when one is rapidly walking around the aisles of corridors to suddenly become glued to the floor. A much-needed invention is one of chewing gum that is odorless and prevents the motion of jaws from being seen while being chewed. I have in front of me a very big treasure. It's a day book of my grandfathers on my mother's side. My grandmother and my grandfather ran this store until he died in 1895, when my mother was only 9 years old. I opened it up and I discovered that it was written in beautiful handwriting in October of 1862. And it lists in here all of the sales that he made. Now, my grandfather owned what was called, I'm writing it here, the Hutchins Dining Rooms. This was located on number 295 to 297 Warren Street in Hudson. And it was called a confectionery and ice cream store as well. And I have in front of me a recipe that they wrote for making candy. When they'd finished with a book, they would then include and write in poetry, information that they had taken out of the newspapers. For example, here's a fun one. It's taking the days of the week and talking about nice little sayings. Monday, now is the time to reform. Tuesday, when things will not suit our will, it's wise to suit our will to things. So pictures and pictures and pictures, bringing lots of memories back. What did the young people do at that time? If you take my time, which is into the 40s, some of them went off to college, some of them went to the next wars. From my class, a lot of people went on to college. I'm trying to think, they went on to be lawyers, wanted to be teachers, and went on to administrative. My career started out as a desire to be a music teacher, which is interesting. Went to Cornell, which I just decided that's where I wanted to go, and the only place I applied for and was accepted. Started out in music, wound up taking all the courses I could in home economics, child care, psychology. So I had a well-rounded background from astrology, I had astronomy, sciences, everything I could take rolled into one. When I finished in 1949, they needed teachers desperately. So my career as a teacher was most unusual. I had thought, I'll go on and get my master's. And my father said, no, you're going to go out and teach. So I had to go to a 6-week summer school at Cortland, which prepared me with 6 weeks of training to be a teacher. I went straight into a school system teaching first grade in a house. And my schoolroom, my teaching class was in a dining room. The kindergarten room was in the kitchen. The other next grade was, the second grade was in the living room. I got a master's in education. And then after 2 years, came back and taught in Red Hook, still in the elementary. I was called back to teach in Red Hook after my first child was born. And they said, we need you. We have a class that is unruly. Would you come in and take over? This was when I was supposedly on maternity leave. I said, all right. I went back in 2 months after my first child was born, went back to Red Hook. And I had to take over this class where the children were walking on the desks. They were doing all kinds of unthinkable things for a first grade. And they asked the teacher to leave. So I remember once this is an incident that wouldn't happen today. But I had a little child who was very, very disruptive. And I think was sitting at my desk. I had him over my knee. I was paddling him. And I looked up, and in the door was standing my elementary principal and my high school supervisor. I thought, uh-oh. They looked at me, smiled, and they walked away. They didn't reprimand me one bit, because I think they thought I was doing what needed to be done to bring that class back to where it ought to be. So I stayed from April to June and in teaching that class. You wouldn't see that today. Today, there would be a lawsuit for paddling a child. After being out of school for 10 years, because I said, I'm staying home for my 3 children. And finally, they called me back because in that meantime, I was very much into music. I had a group called the Do Re Mi, so I was conducting music and had another person playing, and we went into the churches to sing. We went into the nursing homes to sing for the group. And finally, the school says, we need another music teacher, a part-time. So would you come and help? All right. I'm not trained in music, but I did. And I thought it would be a temporary thing, that I would come back home and not be teaching anymore. But they decided they wanted me to stay, so that's when I had to get all that extra education. And I wound up then teaching in Germantown for 17 years of just music. When I came to Germantown, there was a lot of fun, a lot of camaraderie. We got together as teachers, and there were games played, and just on each other. And I see a change in the teaching. And I talk to the teachers. They're teaching to tests. And they're not teaching the whole child. They're teaching to what the government says we need to do. No child left behind, I don't know about. We were able to be more inventive, more creative in what we did. And that I noticed even in the one-room school, the laughter that was there, the fun that we were able to play without being chastised. And it seemed like education was very